Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to everyone. Um, I would like to welcome and thank you for attending today's webinar titled The Impact of Intergenerational Trauma on Eating Disorders by Dr. Carolyn Ross. A few things to note: participants will be muted upon entry and videos turned off. If you need technical assistance, please use the chat box function. We will have about 10 minutes at the end of the webinar to address any questions for the presenter. We do ask that you place your questions in the Q&A section in order to ensure that we do address those. In approximately 1 month, you will receive an email requesting feedback on the impact of this presentation. And lastly, we would encourage you to visit the NCED Training Center at www.ncedis.org/training to see other webinars and training opportunities. Slides from today's presentation will be shared along with the evaluation immediately following the webinar. And I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Carolyn Ross, who is an African-American author, speaker, and expert for the treatment of eating disorders, trauma, and addictions. Dr. Ross is a graduate of the University of Michigan Medical School. She completed a residency in preventative medicine and a master's in public health at Loma Linda University and a fellowship in integrative medicine at the University of Arizona. She is board certified in preventative medicine and in addiction medicine. Dr. Ross has been an international speaker and consultant on issues of mental health, trauma, workplace productivity, and intergenerational trauma. Dr. Ross presented a TEDx Pleasant Grove talk on historical and intergenerational trauma in January of 2020. She is co-founder of the Institute for Anti-Racism and Equity, a consulting group that offers DEI trainings to organizations on diversity, anti-racism, and equity in the workplace. I will now turn things over to Dr. Carolyn Ross.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. We have an ambitious agenda today, so I'm going to go ahead and get started and jump right in. Those are your learning objectives. This is my full bio for your bedtime reading. I love this quote by Bessel Vandercook, who's one of the most well-known trauma therapists and authors. And he says, the ability to feel safe with others is probably the most important aspect of mental health. And I think it's an often overlooked one. We don't necessarily think about it when we're raising our kids. Do our kids feel safe with others? We don't think about it when we go into new workplace situations, etc. But I think this says it all, really. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. This on the right is the pyramid that they developed, which basically shows that they're studying, I'm just going to close this box here. They're studying the effects of trauma from conception all the way up through until death. So conception to death. They are also including studies on historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, and what they're calling social conditions in local context, which I'll speak to in a moment, as well as a list of adverse childhood experiences. So if a child has had any kind of historical trauma, had any of these social conditions, had adverse childhood experiences, this changes the brain or disrupts neurodevelopment. Once the brain is changed, that then causes social, emotional, and cognitive impairment and can lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors like smoking, early promiscuity, drug use, etc. And then that leads to disability, disease, and social problems, whether it be incarceration or chronic medical diseases or chronic mental health issues. And with a high enough ACE score, it can take 20 years off of your life. So this study was not around when I went to medical school. However, it's something I've been speaking about over the last, couple of decades, actually, and it's continuing through the Centers for Disease Control. And I think the quote here on the left is really important because this is the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics who says adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. And as we go through this, I hope you'll be able to understand why he says that, why Dr. Block says that. So what does the ACE study actually? Well, look at the tree on the left here, and it's studying adverse childhood experiences like physical and emotional neglect, divorce, mental illness, incarceration, homelessness, domestic violence, substance abuse, emotional and sexual abuse, and having a family member with depression or mental illness. So that's the original study. Now, the Centers for Disease Control has added adverse community environments, which is the social conditions and local context on the pyramid here. And those include poverty, discrimination, community disruption, lack of opportunity, economic mobility, and social capital, poor housing quality and affordability, and violence. So basically what this study did is turned on its head all of the, what we thought were, true facts about what are the causes of medical conditions. And now we're looking at the root cause being trauma, because we've seen that if a child has one or more, and particularly if they have four or more adverse childhood experiences, including both community environments and the adverse childhood experiences, their risk for medical conditions such as cancer, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, all as well as eating disorders, mental illness, ADHD, and over 40 medical and mental health conditions. Their risk goes way up in adulthood. So bottom line is, something happens to you in childhood, that increases your risk then for these over 40 medical and mental health issues as adults. And no one ever thought that something that happened to you as a child could do that. Well, what does this have to do with eating disorders? Well, we know in the U.S. National Comorbidity Study, survey replication study, almost all women and men with eating disorders had at least one potentially traumatic event. And trauma history was found in children, teens, adults, men, women, all socioeconomic groups, all gender identities, etc., have a history of trauma with eating disorders. And this exposure to multiple traumatic events or recurring exposure to the same trauma increases the risk for how bad the eating disorder affects you. And going further, eating disorders are most associated with emotional, sexual, or physical abuse and emotional neglect. Emotional abuse predicted higher eating, shape, and weight concerns and lower daily functioning. Sexual abuse predicted higher eating concerns. So the relationship, we think, between trauma and eating disorders is mediated by what we call emotional dysregulation, or the inability to manage your emotions, increased heightened sensitivity to emotions, increased, stress response. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. It's important to note that adverse childhood experiences are more common in Black, Indigenous, people of color. In the white population, or in the American population, 2/3 of individuals have at least one adverse child experience, but these are not distributed equally in the population. Children of different races and ethnicities do not experience adversities equally. In every region of the United States, the prevalence of adversities is lowest among Asian children. The prevalence is highest among Black children. And across the world, Indigenous populations are also exposed to higher rates of trauma. So one of the things that some facilities are adding in the study of adverse childhood experiences is this question: in number 1 to really address the race-based traumatic experiences that were not included in the original adverse childhood experiences study. So this question is, to the best of your knowledge, has your child ever been treated or judged unfairly because of his or her race or ethnicity? And we know that 10% of Black non-Hispanic children have experienced interpersonal racism, but the study of this is really early on, and some studies have shown that 90% have had experiences of racism and discrimination, particularly for African-American women. This graph here, you can see that the light blue is for no adverse childhood experiences. Then the next blue is for 1 adverse childhood experience, and the dark blue is 2 or more. So here it's important to just for you to see graphically that Black children are more likely to have higher ACE scores compared to white children. And Black children are overrepresented among children with 2 or more ACEs. So you can see the graph here is 2 or more, and then this one is 1. So for 1 and for 2 or more, Black children are higher than their white peers. So this is the slide that basically just shows you what I mentioned earlier, which is that connection between having had childhood trauma and then later in adulthood developing a list of problems. So this study showed that there was, in a study of 17,000 adults, for each additional adverse childhood experience, there was a 60% increase in attempted suicides. 60%. The increased risk of a depression in adulthood was associated with parental alcoholism was accounted for by a higher risk of adverse childhood experiences in alcoholic families. So I just want you to sit with that a moment. When you go down the list here, this is the proportion of cases of depression, for example, that are attributed to adverse childhood experiences. Individuals who had 5 or more ACEs were 7 to 10 times more likely to report alcohol and drug use. And ACEs also contributed to early onset of drinking before age 14. If we were able to prevent adverse childhood experiences, we could reduce the occurrence of depression by 44.1%. And just on down the line. So these findings are not just in the United States, they are in all developed countries, and the numbers are approximately the same. And those with 4 or more ACEs accounted for a disproportionate share of the preventable causes of health and socioeconomic outcomes. Another metric is that ACEs are more common also in women. So I always say that wherever you go, you take your trauma with you, because we don't often think about trauma as being so pervasive in our lives. You know, that's something that happened when I was a kid, or that I don't need to deal with that, or that doesn't matter. But in point of fact, what happened to you as a child really does matter, and it stays with you throughout your life. So the cartoon says, and there's a nominal fee for that emotional baggage. So trauma affects your work, relationships, school, friendships, how you parent, how you manage your finances, every aspect of your life. I want to play this video by Gabor Mate that talks about the relationship between trauma and addictions. And
trauma isn't what happens to you. It's what happens inside you. It's when you're alone with your pain and sadness, so you can't process it and move through it.
Is it possible to raise your children without trauma?
Life is inherently painful. You can't protect children from that, nor should you try to. What you can do, though, is help them experience it accompanied by a nurturing adult.
all addictive behavior can be traced back to childhood trauma. That's something you assert.
Not everybody who's traumatized becomes addicted, but everyone addicted was traumatized. My major addiction has been to work. The work is so seductive precisely because it's so appreciated by the world. If I think I'm not enough, then I want more and more validation for the world that I'm enough. And my wife said to me, look, you gotta realize you're a workaholic because I'm not putting up with it anymore. So I really had to make a decision.
I definitely struggle with this problem. In August, I had 2 weeks off and I couldn't be the holiday dad.
I'm not sure that you want to stay that way for the rest of your life because you got these 2 young kids. What's the message to them? And that is restless.
That it's their fault.
Yeah, that's somewhat they're not adequate. And when you're restless and unhappy around your kids, they get a message that it's about them. I know there's more to me than just my addicted self. But despite all the teaching that I do, I haven't taught myself. And that represents a kind of powerlessness. And you got to start with admitting that. That is the first step. So this is a highly traumatized society. This is the world in which there's even more need for painful inquiry. We have the capacity within ourselves to turn this around. The answers are all within you. And if you need guidance, it's not how to negotiate the world out there. It's how to negotiate the world within.
And you could substitute addiction for eating disorders in this video. So I want to just briefly touch on the most important effects of trauma. For an adult, Bruce Perry, who's a child psychiatrist, an author and researcher in this area, he says, for an adult, experiences may alter behavior, but for a child, experiences provide the organizing framework of the brain. So if you think of the brain as, it's almost like a computer, trauma changes, and any experience changes how the brain functions, changes the hardwiring of the brain. And that could be positive experiences as well as negative experiences. So the lack of positive experiences, for example, in orphans, also change brain development in a negative way. But the presence of negative experiences changes the brain as well. So what the Centers for Disease Control says is that if a child grows up in a safe, stable, nurturing environment and relationships, they learn empathy, impulse control, anger management, and problem solving. And all of these skills protect against future violence. When that's not present, their brain cells form different connections with each other to better recognize and respond to threats. Even when the threat is no longer there, the stress response system is already on red alert and can remain that way for the rest of their lives. So, and then when you look at children who are in persistently threatening environments, they are much more likely to respond violently. And that's a normal adaptive response. It doesn't mean something's wrong with them. It means something happened to them. And their fight-flight responses is how they have survived. And these responses can often override kind of the non-violent conflict resolution skills. So you think about a child who grows up in a threatening environment or who has been abused or neglected. These are children who then act out, again, a normal adaptive behavior. They may have anger problems. They may have difficulty controlling their emotions. And they also have difficulty with impulse control and so on. And then that just leads to a whole host of other issues. So toxic stress is how ACEs actually change everything. It can negatively affect brain development, immune system, and the stress response system. Now, you know, stress is normal. Everybody has stress. Toxic stress is prolonged or severe stress, and stress that's present without a caring, nurturing adult. So these changes can affect children's ability to pay attention, so then they have attention deficit disorder. It can affect their decision-making and their ability to learn. Children who grow up with toxic stress can have difficulty forming healthy relationships. They may also have unstable work histories as adults and struggle with finances, jobs, and depression throughout their lives. So again, wherever you go, you take your trauma with you. These effects can also then be passed on to their children. Some children can face further exposure to toxic stress from historical trauma or ongoing traumas due to racism, for example, or the impact of poverty on their lives. So that's number 2. Number 3 is trauma affects attachment. And just simply attachment is the bonding between an infant and their caregiver. It doesn't have to be the mother. It could be a father or a grandmother, whoever is their primary caregiver. And you can see that, well, actually, I think the numbers are about 60% of people have secure attachment. And then there's avoidant attachment, where children show up as withdrawn, quiet, and anxious. Ambivalent attachment, where they can be anxious, have trouble focusing, very insecure, always asking a lot of questions. And then disorganized attachment, where kids are angry, depressed, unable to follow directions, have a short fuse, and trouble making friends. I'm sure every one of you listening knows somebody in one of these categories, or knows a child in one of these categories. So this is an important impact on brain development, attachment is. And we've known for a long time that babies who have secure attachment relationships do better in life. They have a better chance of succeeding in life. Studies show that sensitive, affectionate, responsive parenting protects children from toxic stress. Insecure attachment in infancy is associated with maladaptation in preschool and younger children. So healthy attachment improves a child's ability to cope with stress, with new experiences, and also with resilience, which is another protective factor. So number 4 is that trauma can be passed from one generation to another. This little video I'll show you here is showing kind of a demonstration of what we call epigenetic changes. Imagine those little black balls as the experience of a child growing up, and the child goes out into life, and then you see the balls light up, and those are the experiences they have, whether they're negative or positive. And those different experiences then lead them onto different pathways, some of which may not be the best for them. So we know that trauma can induce epigenetic changes, and according to the CDC, epigenetics is the study of how your behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. So that, for example, the gene for an eating disorder can be turned on by trauma, or the gene for addiction can be turned on, or for depression can be turned on. So trauma does not change our DNA, but it changes how the DNA is expressed. Oops. And finally, the impact of trauma can be overcome. The brain has the ability to heal itself, and that's something called plasticity. And there are opportunities at every stage in life to change or remedy the negative effects of trauma and to heal from trauma. We also know that while trauma can be passed from one generation to another, so can resilience. So ways of coping, overcoming traumatic stress, and ways of sustaining your culture despite oppression can also be passed down. So, for example, if your parents or a child's parents overcome a natural disaster and their child witnessed that, they might be able to recall the strength that their parents possess to persevere and overcome a problem in the past, and they can use that in their own lives. So the strategies that help the brain heal include mindfulness, physical activity, creative expression, and routine. And I think this is something that we often don't focus on in raising children, teaching them these different strategies. So let's now switch and talk about intergenerational trauma. In other words, trauma that's passed from one generation to another through epigenetics. So the core of intergenerational or historical trauma is the ripple effect of victimization, where the systemic effect of personal trauma often extends beyond the actual victim and can have profound effect on the lives of significant others, particularly spouses and offspring. So even though your children have not been traumatized, the fact that you have has an effect on your children. So intergenerational trauma is the legacy of pain that results from a family member's personal trauma left unhealed. So here's the definition of intergenerational trauma. It's a psychological term which asserts that trauma can be passed from one generation to another. It refers to specific experiences of trauma across generations of family, not necessarily shared group trauma, which is more historical trauma. Historical trauma then is multi-generational trauma. So trauma over multiple generations, the trauma still is there. And it's experienced by specific cultural, racial, or ethnic groups and related to major events that oppressed a particular group of people because of their status as oppressed, such as slavery, the Holocaust, forced migration, and the violent colonization of Native Americans. Race-based traumatic stress is racial trauma, and it refers to mental and emotional injury caused by encounters with racial bias, discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. And for many BIPOC individuals, that's a daily experience. So some of the mechanisms we talked about epigenetics as a mechanism for intergenerational trauma. Some people have pointed to dissociative identity disorder as a mechanism, not knowing who is safe or whom they belong to. They may be intensely affectionate with strangers or may trust nobody. So that's another one. Unhealed trauma in the parent is transmitted to the child in the attachment bond, as we talked about, and also via messaging about the self, the world, safety, and danger. So these kind of messages could be things like, never trust the police, or don't go to that neighborhood after dark, or don't trust this particular racial group. Those kinds of messages also are passed down to generations. And treatment, we need to really focus not just on children, which we want to, prevent ACEs, but also on the parents or the caregivers, and also teaching resilience to heal the brain. So the internal family systems theory offers 4 strategies. One is the use of culture-informed treatment, and that's particularly important in BIPOC populations. Second is the interruption of unhealthy family communication patterns, communication patterns that really don't enhance connection, they break connection, whether it be rage or negative messages passed on to children, etc. And then being able to give trauma a voice within the family and helping parents offer children the permission to dissociate or to heal. So there are many theories on how to heal trauma. I'm just presenting some of them, but I think what my takeaway is that trauma can hijack a child's life, and the sooner we can address it in the caregivers and in the children, the less likely they are to suffer the consequences. So giving trauma a voice may mean learning about traumas in previous generation, having those conversations within the family about what happened to grandma and grandpa, what happened to your parents, etc. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So intergenerational trauma is associated also with post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's, usually linked to one person experiencing trauma. But some of the studies on twins have estimated that PTSD can be inherited. And that is about 30 to 70% say that. Also, it's important to note that prenatal stress during pregnancy can include metabolic changes, like during famine times, immune changes, such as when you have an illness, and perceived psychological threats like emotional distress or social distress. So in animal studies, stress can be imparted using these psychological and or physical changes, and can affect the fetus, increasing the risk for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, schizophrenia, autism spectrum disorder, and so on. Here are some of the common symptoms that might show up in people who are experiencing intergenerational trauma. One is irrational, intense fears, lack of trust that can't be explained, risky health behaviors, anxiety and shame, food hoarding or overeating, authoritarian parenting styles, it's my way or the highway, high emotional neediness on the part of parents, and living in survival mode. So I'm going to switch and talk just a little bit about historical trauma, because that historical trauma can be passed from one generation to another. There are three basic constructs of historical trauma experience. So historical trauma concepts are: number one, mass trauma is deliberately and systematically inflicted on a target population by a subjugating dominant population. Number two, trauma is not limited to a single catastrophic event, but continues over an extended period of time. Number three, traumatic events reverberate throughout the population, creating a universal experience of trauma. And number four, the magnitude of the trauma derails the population from its natural projected course. I think that's the big one. I'm going to just quickly go through this. Please don't freak out when you see this complicated looking diagram, but it gives you an understanding of how historical trauma can be transmitted generationally. So let's take a dominant group, say settlers in the New World who came from Europe, and look at how they subjugated the native population here in America. Just as an example, how did that happen? So they came here, they found Native Americans, Alaskan natives, and tried to subjugate them. Number one, through segregation and displacement. So putting them on reservations, sending them to boarding schools. The second way that they were subjugated was through physical and psychological violence. And that would be the wars, where they fought against the Native Americans, and then economic destruction. Moving them from their ancestral homes led to loss of resources and legal rights, and then cultural dispossession. In the boarding schools, the children were not able to continue speaking their language, practicing their culture or religion, and so on. So that's what happens to the first generation. And you could put in here of the population of enslaved Africans who were brought to the United States, etc. Now, the trauma response can be mitigated by resilience and other protective factors that you see here. But the usual responses include a physical response. So nutritional stress affects the immune system. There can be biochemical changes, hormonal changes, changes in the stress response system, and then the expression of genes changes. And this all leads to malnutrition, diabetes, high blood sugar, infectious disease, heart disease, high blood pressure, and cancer. The other response is a social one, where there's a higher suicide rate, domestic violence, unemployment, substance abuse, child maltreatment, and poverty. And that is what we are seeing, both of those in the native populations that were violently colonized. And then psychological responses include PTSD, depression, panic and anxiety, which leads to anger and aggression, social isolation, shame, loss of self-worth, and so on. So this is what happens to the second generation. And then that changes the expression of the genes for the things we've been talking about. And that change then is passed on to the third generation. So just briefly, it's not just trauma that can change the expression of genes, but all of these things can have epigenetic effects. And it's important to understand that epigenetics and understanding epigenetics can take the focus off of the blame on the individual. Like, you know, we always hear, you're living in a larger body, people say, well, why don't you just eat less and exercise more? So that blame being placed can be mitigated by understanding this may be the historical trauma. And it may make acceptance easier with less shame and guilt and stigma. So next is an example of a patient that I had whose mother was a Holocaust survivor. And she had 2 children, and my patient is the girl. And you can see here that the mother raised them in such a way that well, let me go back. The mother's adaptation to the Holocaust was to parent using kind of an authoritarian style, or psychic numbing, which is, you know, having difficulty expressing emotions. And my patient, the mother in this slide, perceived that parenting style as emotionally abusive and neglectful. And she developed obesity and alcoholism. And then her children were also showing some effects of the trauma. So we know in general, the study of offspring of Holocaust survivors is how we first started learning about epigenetics. And many of these offspring have things like anxiety, generalized fear, behavioral problems, and so on. So just again, in looking at Holocaust survivors and their offspring, one study revealed that Holocaust survivors themselves revealed 6 main attitudes towards food because of being in the Holocaust. One was trouble throwing food away, even if it was spoiled. And we see that in survivors also of some other things like, you know, the hunger winter in Denmark. Number 2, chronically storing excess food. Number 3, craving specific foods. Number 4, difficulty standing in line for food. And number 5, experiencing anxiety when food is not readily available. And finally, number 6, strong feelings of empathy towards others suffering from hunger. So many of the studies showed that adolescent girls who were of European descent, adolescent Jewish females, appeared to be at higher risk of developing abnormal attitudes and behaviors towards eating compared to other groups. And there's a lot more on this. I mean, I think it's such a fascinating area to study. There's a lot of different conclusions that you can reach, but I think the biggest takeaway is that even when the offspring of Holocaust survivors never discussed their parents' experience in the Holocaust, they showed signs of increased post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and other symptoms. So that's a pretty clear-cut indication that you don't have to experience trauma to experience the effects of trauma that are intergenerational. So I want to show you the next video. Let me start here. Historical trauma in Native populations. Well, the main researcher in this area is Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, and she defines historical trauma as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations emanating from massive group trauma experience. Before I start this, the first part of the video shows Native people in America. The second part of the video shows Native Canadians, or First People of Canada. Just want you to look for the intergenerational effects of trauma.
When Yvonne Walker-Keshik steps foot on what was once Holy Childhood of Jesus boarding school in Harbor Springs, painful memories come flooding back.
Everything that was Native American, they tried to destroy.
Yvonne was one of thousands of Native American kids, many of them Odawa children, sent to this Catholic boarding school between 1829 and 1983.
And I often wondered, how other people, other kids who went to the school, how did they deal with it? And I know some of them didn't. Some of them became alcoholics, drug addicts, committed suicide. I know a lot of them just couldn't make it. So it was pretty tough.
Students couldn't speak their language or practice traditions. Yvonne says she was beaten by nuns as she struggled to learn.
I spent a lot of afternoons, lunch hours, staring at the blackboard because I couldn't do the problem on the board. And when she'd come back and she'd find me still standing there and the problem's not done, she would grab me by my hair and use me for an eraser, drag me back and forth across the blackboard, until she erased the numbers.
In the 19th and 20th centuries, the United States funded more than 350 boarding schools with the goal of assimilating and separating the tribes. Holy Childhood was one of the longest running. Students often describe themselves as survivors of physical and even sexual abuse. What do you think the legacy of this place is going to be?
For those of us who went there, it's kind of like it's a bad history in the history of Native people.
Children ended up at these schools a number of ways. For some families, it was the only way to keep their children fed and with a roof over their heads. Others were forcibly removed from their homes. Yvonne and her 4 siblings were taken after her single father was charged with child neglect.
The judge told him that he had to put us in this boarding school or put us up for adoption. Well, he didn't want us taken away from him, and so he put us in school.
What happened to your identity here at the school?
It kind of made us ashamed of who we were. They made us feel bad because of who we were. Being called names all the time and being put down all the time. And we noticed too that they paid more attention to the lighter-haired kids and the lighter-skinned kids.
I grew up not knowing my language, and in fact, I kind of felt a bit ashamed about our language and our identity because it seemed like they were, meaning my parents and my aunts and uncles, were ashamed too in some way because they didn't want to talk about it and they didn't want to share with us about who we were.
There was a lot of fear. I think the fear that they put in him, the terror that they put in him, I mean, he managed to bring that with him. It went into our family, and I learned terror and fear and all that as well as a child.
Okay, so one of the issues with Native population is that food insecurity also contributes to higher risk for a binge eating disorder. Okay, this is Dr. Joy DeGry, who talks about the effects of slavery today.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on And then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes, so 300 years of trauma, no help, freed. No help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear, long enduring trauma. So I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about, he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course. There's a secret. Because everybody black knows that even though the black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work, because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, you know, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome.
So that's, she has a book by the same name, and I highly recommend it. I think this slide, the takeaway really is that eating disorders are just as prevalent in African Americans as in other populations across the board, including other BIPOC populations. And I think we struggle because there's a lack of individualization on some of the measures and treatment, the lack of cultural competency, and so on. So this book is incredible and amazing. She outlines the history of body standards and the way in which thinness was used to uphold white superiority as recent as the 20th century. The denigration of Black women for their bodies may have served as a driver for the creation of the thin ideal and comparison between this, denigrated Black body and the elite white Christian women. So the fear of the Black body was integral to the creation of the slender aesthetic in American women. Another factor is that BMI is not a good measure for Black women because they may have higher BMIs than white women, but lower mortality rates. And this makes it a very not useful measure. So one of the things that we see is that in areas of the country of the United States where there was a high degree of enslaved Black Americans, you also see high incidence of diabetes, high blood pressure, premature death from heart disease, prostate cancer, and so on. And that is a manifestation of historical and intergenerational trauma. Okay, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to have really enough time to do a case, but hopefully if you have questions about the case, I'm happy to answer them, but let's move on because I want you to have time for questions. So in this study by Nita, they presented three identical case studies demonstrating disordered eating symptoms in white, Hispanic, and Black women. 44% of clinicians identified white women's behavior as problematic. 41% identified Hispanic women's as problematic, but only 17% identified the Black woman's problem as problematic. Since, over the past few years, we've seen a lot of change starting and hopefully continuing, but there's a refusal to remember, denial, dissociation, and disavowal in the absence of slavery from the trauma literature. I know the American Psychological Association has come out with a number of papers to address that, and hopefully that will change. So what do we do? First step, I really strongly recommend universal screening in your practices, in medical offices and pediatric offices of trauma, universal screening using the ACE quiz. Secondly, taking a detailed history, including relationship dynamics, trends in the family, what patterns are showing up, what types of trauma did your ancestors experience, and what traumatic events affected them. You can do a family tree, looking for a genogram, looking for these events. This is my family tree, and you can see, and I talk about this in my TEDx Pleasant Grove talk, that when I did this genogram, I was shocked that there was trauma that riddled my family tree. You can see it in every generation. And this led me to want to help my family to interrupt the transmission of intergenerational trauma. So the trauma-informed approach really focuses on safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, peer support, collaboration, empowerment, and cultural competency. So using the ACE quiz, also you can work on identifying when the trauma occurred and how that might affect brain development, and then teach stress management and emotional regulation skills. So I'm going to stop here. And if there are, these are the shameless plugs for my books, Treating Black Women with Eating Disorders. I have a chapter in there, and these are books written by myself. And then if we have questions, I'm happy to go there and talk to you.
Thank you so much. We do have a lot of questions coming in. Just as a quick reminder, following today's presentation, you will receive the slides from today's presentation, as well as a link to the evaluation. And any questions we do not get to answer, we will send out an email with responses from Dr. Ross. Usually in about a week or so, we can get those back to you. So the first question is, racism as an ACE is addressed in C.A. Pearl's Part 2. So it is addressed with every pediatric patient family in California clinics. Is this done in other places?
And not uniformly, and that's why I'm sounding the horn, saying the universal screening is the first step, because we can't address what we don't know. But no, it's not mandated in other states. As you know, the United States hasn't mandated as a federal issue. It's more state by state.
Okay, next question reads, do you think that the white population is accurately reporting ACEs? And does the economic demographic skew results or reporting?
Yeah, I think ACEs are pretty accurately reported. I mean, most of the studies are based on this group of 17,000 people who started with the study at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, where I live. So most of the studies are done on that population, but newer studies are also being done. And no, I don't think, when you're doing a survey, it's pretty anonymous. So there's no real reason to not report. There may be underreporting though, like, some people who don't recognize certain types of adverse childhood experiences. And I forgot the second part. What was the second part of the question?
Does the economic demographic skew results or reporting?
Yeah, because when you look at adverse community experiences, that tree that I showed you, things like poverty are a source of trauma. So definitely, if you have adverse community experiences, then you will have higher levels of ACEs.
Okay. If a child grows up in a loving and nurturing environment, but then experiences a traumatic event of losing a parent to a sudden death, does that trauma equal that of growing up in an abusive or traumatic environment as it relates to developing an eating disorder?
Well, I don't think we have that level of research around this. I mean, that's really drilling down to fine details. But loss of a parent, for example, is one of the traumas that my family experienced, with my father passing away before most of my siblings had reached 18. And so I think it's something important to look at. But at this point, the traumas or the ACEs are all considered equal, and it's the number of ACEs that changes things. Now, we may have research down the line that reveals more, but it's really the number of ACEs that makes the risk higher, and it's sequential. So if you have one ACE, it's not as much. If you have 5 ACEs, it's a lot.
Okay. Next question reads, what is your suggestion on helping adult children navigate effects of intergenerational trauma and navigate the relationships with their parents?
Oh my goodness, that's a tough one. If you're aware of intergenerational trauma, I mean, what I did, and I encourage you to look at my TEDx talk because I talk about that process a little bit. But I think the most important thing you can do is start a dialogue in your family and just talking about your experiences if your parents are open. If they're not open to talking about it, then work on yourself, because you can be the point person that changes the transmission to the next generation and the next and the next. So I went through my family and sent out the ACE quiz and encouraged them to discuss it with me, and also encouraged them to look at it within their own lives and find resources for healing.
And that was kind of a two-part question. It said, particularly if their parents are not open, willing, or capable to acknowledge that trauma is still driving their life and impairing relationships with their adult children.
Yeah.
And I know you kind of
work on yourself. You can't change your parents all the time. You just work on yourself. I think it's really important that we not try to fix the past, but just work on healing the present. My parents, my mother was not open to those discussions. So I focused on myself and my children and moved on from there.
Okay. Would the ongoing war on terror count as historical trauma for the millennial generation and their subsequent children?
I think time will tell on that. I'm not exactly sure. I don't think the war on terror would be considered a historical trauma. Not, unless perhaps you're a Muslim, and we've had that war on terror since 9/11, and a lot of Muslim Americans have experienced ethnic-based or religious-based trauma.
How many boarding schools still exist or convert to other use in the U.S.?
Yeah, the last boarding schools went away in the 1960s. So we still had them up through the 1960s. There are no more boarding schools now anywhere, not in the U.S., not in Canada.
Okay. Next question is the 2004 study on eating disorders and trauma in the Holocaust survivors. What are the 6 main attitudes towards food as a result of their experiences?
Well, I did cover that in the presentation. I don't know that I can get back to that at this point. If you want to email me, I'm happy to email you the results. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but I did list those. I know one was anxiety around standing in line for food, hoarding food, empathy with people who are experiencing hunger. Those are 3 of them.
Okay, and hopefully we have time for one last question here. African American parents use physical punishment as a way to protect from harm in the community. Relived slavery punishment on children. Any comments on this?
Well, I don't think all African American parents use corporal punishment, so that may be an older understanding. But if in your family corporal punishment was used, I think the work that Joy DeGry has done illuminates some of that. And you can see from the short video that I showed you why that might be as a protective mechanism for enslaved parents to keep their kids in line. But I think that's going by the wayside generally.
Okay, and I know we are out of time. Thank you all so much for attending, and Dr. Ross, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I will email the remaining questions to Dr. Ross for her to provide responses, and then I will email those out to all attendees within the next week or so. Dr. Ross, I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to say.
No, thank you for listening. It's been really fun, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to cover every single slide, but hope you got the message overall.
Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Bye.